3, 2, 1, go.
Everyone at the moment, it seems, is selling AI.
As much as you think it's thinking for itself, it's technically not.
That may be marketing, it may be vaporware, it may be something, but
There's a common misconception about what AI actually is.
Unintended data disclosures.
it doesn't matter what the product is, right? It's got AI built into it now.
The horse has left the stable.
From a security perspective,
The good thing is everyone's just following the horse in a little clown car.
this could be a real problem for us.
How close can you get to the horse without the horse running faster?
It's not a person,
How can AI make me do my things better?
and it's not going to do that.
And how comfortable is the saddle that you're going to jump on?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Cloud Architects Podcast. We have some amazing insights from Mr. Saaim Khan. Can you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background?
About 5 years ago, I started my own cybersecurity consulting company after having been a consultant for many, many years. I work with organizations typically from size 1 to size 500, helping them build and run their security programs. And over the course of the last 20 odd years, I've had the privilege, opportunities, or bad luck of being in many a security-led situation.
That's, you know, I was going to say that's a
like that,
fantastic introduction, and we're super pleased to be talking to you. Everyone at the moment, it seems, is selling AI. It doesn't matter what the product is, right? It's got AI built into it now. Now, that may be marketing, it may be vaporware, it may be something, but there's a very clear shift. I think everyone's mindset is sort of switching to this: how can AI make me do my things better? And then, you know, when we look at it from a security perspective, this could be a real problem for us, right? And I think there are some things that organizations oftentimes need to think about before they go off and buy these products and these services. Are we just doomed here? Is this something where, you know, the horse has left the stable and we are, you know, it is what it is already? Or do you think that there's an opportunity for organizations to dip a toe in and do this in a measured way?
Okay, so I mean, I like that horse has left the stable analogy, and I'll kind of add to that. The horse left the stable a long time ago, Chris. And since then, we've been in a little clown car trying to catch up, and every now and then try to jump over the horse and actually try to get a hold of it, right? I think before we even dive into the concept of AI and how, whether it's a genuine feature or a vaporware or something of that sort, it actually goes back to a much more fundamental point, which is the classic security versus convenience argument. So why is the world so drawn towards AI? It's not because people willingly want some synthetic, you know, lines of code or self-aware lines of code or whatever doing stuff for them. It's because it's doing stuff for them. It's the convenience angle, right? And that's why people get drawn to AI so much. Oh, so you're telling me that I don't have to look at this 75 sheet Excel file. I can just pop it in and it'll get analyzed and I'll get insights right away. And that's what everyone's kind of marketing, right? Whether it's a security tool or if it's just a regular IT tool or whatever. So it's really that's the argument here. So it's not going to stop. Even an organization like mine, we have embraced AI on a number of things where we would use it because it allows our consultants to get more time to do more qualitative work without spending time doing grunt work. But I guess the most important thing, or rather what I have found, is setting some kind of a barricade or some kind of rules of play so that you've actually got some kind of control over the way this is going. It is a largely unregulated and a largely unexplored field at this stage with the amount of generative stuff that's coming out. I mean, there's a whole dark side to it, which I won't get into, but if you're in the know or if you've been watching the news, there's a whole rise of, you know, fabricated materials, let's just call it that, without going too much into it. So on the security side, the first thing that I sort of want to, I guess, add to this is a few years ago, you're familiar with the story with Samsung's engineers, software engineers, who kind of started uploading stuff into into ChatGPT, whatever version was at the time, constantly adding stuff to their learning models and their training data. How are companies actually prepared to deal with this? I mean, if let's say we're four IT managers, meeting over a drink after work and talking about the woes of our company, and all of us are talking about this problem that, hey, we have this AI beast, lurking over our heads. How do we deal with it? I'm pretty sure, and I'm pretty sure of the response, but just by show of hands, how many IT managers in our little group of four would say, let's just block all these AI services?
Yeah,
absolutely. Agreed.
That's always the easiest and the quickest path, right? Is to just turn it off.
But we got to be like Warren, because he didn't raise his hand, right? So let's channel a little bit of Warren here, which is, it's going to happen. So you might as well set some guardrails and talk about the rules of engagement. And that's very similar to a concept that we as IT people know, which is the acceptable use policy, or the acceptable use guidelines. And that is what should now be extended to AI platforms as well. But it's not just about saying that you can use AI, but use it responsibly. That's not enough. We have to really think about it. And that really comes down to thinking about how we as a company work, or how that company works, which is, for example, if you're using any of the popular collaboration platforms from Google or Microsoft, they've got some kind of co-pilot or co-authoring capability built in. Limit it first to just that, because that way you've got some kind of control over no rogue stuff happening. That's one. The second is you talk about guidelines on how these tools can be used. For example, for one of our clients, we actually brought down this whole one-pager, like A4 two-sided thing on how would you prompt. So you're actually proactively saying, hey team, if we want to start using AI and generative AI tools, we should be using these kind of prompts, which are: replace the company name with a descriptor instead of the actual name. Remove any kind of references to the customers or the third parties that you're working with. So for example, let's say if there was a company, let's say, Chris's company made widgets, right? So Goose and Widgets. We shouldn't say Goose and Widgets in the name. We should say a widget manufacturer. Or let's say if it's looking at a particular industry, you might want to make it a bit more vague. So that is one really important thing. The second is talking about setting a rule that this is what's allowed, everything else is not allowed by default. And doing so is literally a breach of, you running off with companies' data. It should be dealt with that seriously, because you want to enable your staff, but you also don't want to hand off firecrackers to everybody in an indoor environment and say, go check these out. You want everybody to go outside in a well-ventilated area with the right safety equipment before that you want them to try out these firecrackers, right? So those are kind of like, broad strokes of what people should be thinking about when it comes to using AI within companies.
See, I really like that. I think those are very, very practical guidelines, right? And you're talking here about principles that in many instances are things that we've seen and done before, right? We're just let's take away the AI and let's use cloud storage as an example. This is how many organizations approach the use of cloud storage when Dropbox and OneDrive and all of these things first started sort of, making a name and really becoming widely used. We didn't want to, refine or sort of restrict our users from having the benefits of these things, but we also didn't want our data to go absolutely everywhere, right? So I think that's really, really nice, sort of very practical guideline there. Nick, I think you were about to say something before I jumped in and spoke over you.
I laud the fact that we're all adults, but we also know that just because we say something's policy doesn't free us from the burden of policy enforcement. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an entire industry dedicated to trying to enumerate and restrict shadow IT. And how are users not going to go, this sounds like a wonderful idea, but actually this allows me to do my job quicker, faster, easier. So I'm just going to do it anyway.
Well, no, that's actually true. And for the same companies I've given you an example of who've actually gone ahead and done that. Previously, the shadow IT component of what was being discovered was along the lines of random online, graphing tools or online mind mapping software or some kind of online graphic design software like some Canva knockoff or something, which they were using, right? Now it's all about these tools, right? It's all about some generative AIs like John AI, Jill AI, Joe AI, whatever, right? And there are a couple of really interesting use cases as well. However, one thing, going back to what Chris mentioned, none of this is new. If you go down to the nuts and bolts of it, it's just a placeholder. Right now, that placeholder's got AI. Previously, it was cloud. In the middle, there was also ML, if anyone remembers that little phase. And then in the middle, we did kind of dovetail to quantum computing, but that quickly died. So you've got those buzzwords, right? And all these people, like people are like moths, and all of these technologies are like light bulbs, and we get attracted to it. And if we get too close, we are going to get hurt, and we are going to cause some grievous harm, digital harm, not real harm. Um, but that being said, this is where what's one of the ways that people have tried to combat shadow IT? It's by really pushing a single sign-on, a federated ID approach, where sure, use whatever tools you want, and then you kind of do that. It's got a bit of a it's a double-edged sword. You also federating your ID with systems you may not necessarily want to, but there are controls in place for that. So when you do an SSO integration, you kind of limit the information that that system would get about you, right? Coming back to that point you made, people will go and do that, but that's where internet filtering technologies improved quite a bit. We can include things like that, and I'll conversely say this: if what you have available to you is really good, you won't venture too much outside of that. And that's why these co-authoring tools within the Microsoft world or within the Google world might be worthwhile, because it will allow you to kind of just have that co-authoring experience or co-creation experience, right? One of the biggest uptakes of technology I've seen in the AI space has been along the lines of the GitHub Copilot. So co-authoring tools are really good. Um, and there is also a new thing on the horizon, which is with the AI tools, some consulting companies, mine itself included, we've opted to not go down the popular AI tool route. We use it in a limited capacity, and that's also meant that we've had to fork out some cash to make sure that we have our data sandboxed, and that too, it's a limited capacity. But things like the Amazon Bedrock product, which allows you to build custom LLMs, which are completely private and only for your use and requires a bit of training as well. We've gone that route as well. And we've started training models internally for use cases. So there are things, as long as people are willing to invest time and to explain that. And we've been speaking to our consultants, at least, about the fact that what we're doing, what we're planning to do. So it kind of then makes everyone think that, oh, okay, these are the different things that are available to me. So that's my limited experience, of course, but yes, people will get drawn to doing things which are easier, and policies will just go out the window if convenience comes in. And that goes back to our old security versus convenience argument.
Thing is, I also believe that there's a common misconception about what AI actually is. I think if we go back to, and this is one of the things that I think people struggle with a lot, is they read and they, it's not AGI just yet. And as much as you think it's thinking for itself, it's technically not. It's just a bunch of connections happening, and it's exactly that. It's an LLM and an SLM. It's a large language model. It's trying to predict what the next word's going to be. And I think people have a huge misconception about what that actually is. And, when they see something like Llama 3 or whatever the case may be, and they see that big 70B or 80B behind it, they have no idea what that 80B actually means. And it's stands for 80 billion, right? And so, the fine tuning aspect, if you look at, let's say, like you said, Bedrock, Azure's got very similar things where you go in, you can make the ML workspace or whatever the case may be is private. You build the compute, you fine tune the models, and those sorts of things. But I think there's that misconception: it's only giving the data, like it all comes back down to that data piece. It's just it's a layer that's bolted on top. And this is that's where the next revolution comes in, right? Chris, Nick, you guys have been dealing with Office 365 data for years, right? Who has access to the OneDrive? Who has access to the SharePoint data, the Teams data? Is there DLP in place? Because if all that stuff is there, Copilot makes no difference when it comes to that sort of security. It's looking at the data and the security and the role-based access control that's already there. Why? Because it's an LLM. It's not thinking for itself. It's not like you're bringing in this robotic person into the organization to sit next to, and you're going like, here, dude, here's my badge. Here's your access. Go forth and conquer. I mean, and I'll say it again, Copilot is just that, right? It's a co-pilot. It's not an autopilot. It's not like this. And I think that's a very big misconception. And people go in and they buy into this big thing, and they're like, but why won't ChatGPT do this thing for me? And you're like, no, dude. It's not a person. And it's not going to do that. So I think there's a huge misconception there, and perhaps maybe people are not sort of understanding that section of it, right? It only goes as far as you want it to.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think part of that though is also they don't understand the risk, right? Because it's we've conditioned our user environments, our users to worry about data loss in the fact that they have left their laptop in the taxi after being at the pub on a Friday, stuff like that, right? But what possibly they don't always understand, and maybe we're not there yet as far as being able to do a good job of the education part of why AI can be dangerous, right? That inadvertent data leakage. We talked about the Samsung engineers just earlier, right? That scenario where, do you understand as a user that if you use Copilot and you use our sort of homegrown Azure OpenAI sort of model that we have internally, nothing's going to leak out of that because we can contain it. However,
Correct.
If you then take the same prompt, but you go to Gemini or ChatGPT on the internet, you could potentially be leaking some really important stuff. And I think that's again where, one of the things I say very often, and we've had some interesting debates on the show about sort of the user training piece, right? Is that we need to evolve our user training almost as quickly as the technology evolves, because when we can because our users are not stupid, they just need to understand this stuff in a way that makes sense to them, right? So I think there's that misconception piece there, Warren, that you were talking about. But
that's exactly it. I think it's like you say, it's definitely the next big thing, right? You can see that happening. But provided that the company's gone and followed like data leak prevention techniques, Copilot runs in that sandboxed fashion. I mean, you should technically not be able to copy and paste company spec or information from your email or your document to a ChatGPT interface.
That is the problem.
That should not happen.
And that's the problem that you have. And you're getting to it, but the problem is that most organizations have not worried about their data security and their data estate, because it's a difficult problem to solve. A very difficult problem to solve. Right?
It is a difficult problem to solve, also because of the number of vectors that could go wrong or that could be a problem. And it's literally compounding every day. So we've managed to only in the last 5 years introduce the concept of application sandboxing on the mobile environment, and the concept of browser sandboxing to a debatable degree. But going back to what Warren said, right? I've actually had that discussion with a number of customers, a number of other stakeholders, in fact, a number of other consultants, to which I got this following response in some degree. When you don't know how something works, it's like magic. Don't tell me how this works. Let me enjoy the magic, right? And largely when we do this awareness drive, because we've done AI awareness education for a lot of our customers, right? The customers will say, sure, that means the staff that we train, that yes, I will no longer use these programs for work-related data. But what they're also doing is that they're taking out their phone, using the ChatGPT app, and then like taking pictures and like doing that. So it is like herding cats to a large extent, where you're trying to bring them to understand that don't put this data in any kind of public service, a free or even a paid public LLM or generative AI piece, right? They won't do it for work, but they'll do it for their personal life. So God knows how much information is already gone there about them. And coming back to that original point that you made, Warren, at the end of the day, ChatGPT is just autocomplete on steroids. That's really what it is, right? And actual artificial intelligence is only something that you will start seeing companies like OpenAI now try to explore with the new model, which they're dubbing O1. And even with that,
it thinks for itself. Yeah, it goes back and forth with itself.
Actually, no, that's a really good sleight of hand. It doesn't think for itself. What it's actually doing.
I know it doesn't think for itself, but what it's doing is it's chatting with itself. It's saying, okay, correct, well, if that's wrong, and then it's going backwards and forwards with itself. And there are two really core components to think about here. Number one is the concept of autonomous simultaneous agents, and this was introduced 18 months ago with an open source tool called AutoGPT, where you could take multiple agents, give it an open AI API key, and it'll basically just run amok. And then you'd have to tell them not to be polite with each other because they'd get stuck in a hello or a goodbye loop or a thank you loop. It'd be, thank you, no, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
And the second is hallucinations. So I'll give you a real example, right? So when this whole thing, exploded, there's a really cool tool which is called GPT for All, which is an offline tool that you can run off your local computer, and you can load multiple different models. So pick a model from Hugging Face, download it, and you can load it. It makes that whole process really simple. So we tried it out. The problem with, even if you had 500B, right, 500 billion parameters, it still does not remove the risk of hallucinations. So being a consultant doing GRC, you kind of start just by sheer volume of the work you do. You can almost rote learn the entire standards that you're working with day in, day out, right? So I know what clause A5 of the ISO 27001 framework is talking about. So obviously you have it's all about organizational controls. So that's okay. That's all right. 37.
That's why they keep me on a leash.
But the hallucination aspect is where, so we ran through it. So we fed it some limited data. We fed it the ISO controls, the new 27001 controls. We fed it some sample policies, and we made a nice little vector database around it as well. It still started hallucinating things. It still started, giving us incorrect answers. And the one thing which I think is it's a nice and a bad thing is, I don't know if you realize, but most generative AI programs are also lazy. And I'll elaborate. Once it figures out a deductible, a pattern on which it can generate, the subsequent generations will degrade in quality because they will just keep looping back to the previous, to the previous, to the previous. It's almost like
isn't that but by design though? Just as a sidebar, because like we think about it, AI is quite expensive. Like from a GPU capacity sort of thing, you would want to make a model as efficient as possible. You would technically do that by default, like by design. Right?
Yes and no. In the sense that, yes, once you figured out the deduction model, yes, you won't, the next query that comes in will obviously revert to what it already knows, as opposed to trying to compute and figure out a new way of doing it, right? But what I'm talking about is the quality of the response itself. So what happens is, let's say, okay, so real example, I was working on trying to summarize about 400 different findings. And what I wanted to do, I thought it would be nice if each of these detailed 400 findings had a nice 5 to 7 word summary title of each finding. So whoever's reading can actually have something more qualitative as opposed to just looking at the reference to the standard. So I fed it into my offline LLM. And I think I was using Llama 70B. And it's trained and everything and whatever, right? But it was going through the organizational controls. That's why I started with A5. So it basically deducted that because of the keywords that are in the descriptions of my findings, which keep referring to the word documents and PDFs, it just keeps referring to that because, of course, it was a document review of various things. The title started becoming documented process not enforced. And then I had about 200 odd findings where the title was literally the same: documented findings not enforced, because it deduced that because this description matches what I'm trying to do, therefore it must be the correct summary. So it did not take into context the fact that yes, the document was the documented controls were not enforced, but something's talking about DLP, something's talking about web filtering, something's talking about background checks not being done, something's talking about something else. So like a ton of things, right? But it just took that and just went with it. So I spent maybe a total of 5 to 8 minutes figuring, working on this and getting that output. But I ended up wasting half an hour because I kept thinking it would improve, but it didn't. At the end of which, we took the 400, we split them into 100. I gave the other 300 to 3 other people and said, hey guys, we have 2 hours each to do this. Let's just convene again around lunchtime and just make sure that this document's done. That's what happens, right? I mean, people and with reliance. I am very, very pedantic by nature. That's probably the nature of what I do. So I want to make sure it's completely right before I give it to someone, or at least 80% right, so I can at least stand by it. Most people will actually find this. There's actually another problem here, guys, which I've spoken about in the past. One is the laziness in fact checking. So people are just generating content, and no one's fact checking it and publishing it out to be true. Obviously, that
happens more than people think. Hey,
correct.
A lot.
I've been bugging a lot of my buddies, fellow business owners who started embracing social media posts on LinkedIn and so on, and they use AI tools, right? So I'm like, hey, good to know you're using GPT-4. You should try GPT-4o now. They're like, how can you tell? I'm like, because of the way that your post is structured. That's not the way you talk. That's not the way you write. So I know it's not you. The second is, are you familiar with the mythology of Ouroboros? Okay, so Ouroboros is a snake eating its tail. And what's happening is, so this is what's happening. You have a ton of tools generating AI content, yes? And all of that's being published online.
Yeah, so the AI is going to be feeding itself.
Okay. Correct. And the overall quality, so that bell curve, right? Just imagine the bell curve. Right now, the bell curve is like this. It's a very steep bell. But over time, the bell's going to start decreasing in height because the quality is just going to keep going down. And then it's going to be like that movie Idiocracy, where the general intelligence is just going to get lowered. And also, the other thing is, the more people use AI, the worse it gets. Because the same example I gave you with my 400 findings, imagine that on a much larger scale. So you're right in the case that where it finds an efficient A to B connection, it's just going to say, yep, this is it. Unless it gets prompted that ignore the previous A to B connection, find a new connection from A to B.
There's going to be no such thing as original content anymore. We are going to be like dinosaurs, Nick.
No, that's not the case. That's not the case. I'm going to say something which might offend all 3 of you, what I'm about to say now. So do any of you
we
gentlemen
like a bit of offense. Actually,
it's good.
Okay. I mean, given the nature of the name of the podcast and by virtue of what you guys do. So are you familiar with a company called 37 Signals? They're pretty big. They came up with a fantastic CRM called Basecamp, a project management tool called Basecamp. Mm-hmm. They had another product, which is a big hit, called Highrise a few years ago. Mm-hmm. They've completely abandoned AWS now. And they've just built their own data center because they're like, the economies and efficiencies of AWS or any cloud provider are just not there anymore. We actually are saving close to, I think it was like 300 grand or 400 grand a year just by moving away from AWS, even factoring the CapEx costs.
And they wrote a pretty compelling and comprehensive blog post. I read the post. I can't remember how long ago it was now, where they break that entire decision down with costs.
Correct.
And it was mind blowing. Like when you really think about it, right? And it's an interesting point because I don't think so many businesses and organizations are still thinking that, we got to go to the cloud because more secure, it's going to save us money, this, and this. I wonder how many of them are actually reevaluating or continuously evaluating the process, right?
100%. And before, to this day, it's 2024 when I started my transition from IT consulting to cyber consulting, 2008 or something. At that point, the concept of, hey, don't just do a lift and shift. All right. People still talk about lift and shift today.
100%.
Right?
100%. Yes.
The thing is, look, I haven't read the blog post in its entirety, but I suppose it's all relative. Not everybody is capable of writing Basecamp from the ground up. I think you'll find, it's no secret that LinkedIn, I think, is still on-prem, right? Or at least in their own DCs. They haven't moved yet. And Microsoft bought them, I think like, how long? 10 years ago? 8 years ago? I can't even remember. I think if a company is incredibly efficient at writing their own software and building everything from the ground up, they're incredibly efficient at optimizing what it is that they have and getting the most of what it is that they've got. But for certain companies, they don't necessarily have that or that skill inside, where they don't have the engineers to do those sorts of things. Look at what if you read Elon Musk's biography by Walter Isaacson, and he talks about Twitter and when he moves it to X and the way he's able to optimize those servers, he literally throws everything he has at doing those things from the inside. I think it's a different story. But I do think that for I would say 80% of the companies out there, it's still there. It is still there to sort of
don't forget about
the path of least resistance.
Don't forget about the 12% that are still running server 2008, right?
Okay. But let me point out something else, which is interesting, right? So a little video streaming service called Prime moved away from their own distributed serverless computing framework and went back to monolith. Just saying. but
that's what I'm saying. It's very. I think it's when you are capable of building something from the ground up and utilizing the hardware from start to finish, you'll find Prime's probably using some sort of audio and video codec that works better when it's on bare metal, and it's probably, there's a reason it's sitting there, because there was an abstraction in between the hypervisor and the orchestrator or something like that that's probably sitting there. So I think it's all probably got to do something with that. But I get it completely. And I think in some ways, that's pretty much what's, like you say, it's what's happening with AI, is people are going to be spending all of this cash, sort of moving into this AI thing and then realizing, hold on, was it what I needed? And then sort of moving backwards or something to that effect. I think people, and this is like you say, people are just jumping on and jumping onto the horse and not checking to see if their seat's tied on or whatever. Like, you can't just jump onto the horse, dude. Like, just take a step back.
We one of the things we have said previously, I think, on this show as well, is that AI very often is just it's a problem looking for a use case to solve, right? Many organizations are on this hype, like we need AI, but they don't necessarily have the use cases, or they haven't taken the time to figure out the best use cases for the technology, right? So I think it's all a circle and it's all a cycle, and you kind of really need to think through it. But I wanted to get back to, sorry, if you had something.
I was going to say 100%, and
Yeah.
and just like it's the, like you said, it's a hammer and nail analogy here as well, right? Most organizations do not need AI. They just need someone to come in and help them with automation and maybe write them a couple of Python scripts to do some data scraping. That's all that most people need. Nobody needs AI. And look, this is going to be published. So I'm happy to go on record and say this. You don't need AI. You just need a good automation middleware and someone who can write Python scripts.
And before I get fired, I'm going to just make sure. Before I get fired, I'm going to say that this is his opinion, and his opinion are his own.
Warren. No,
Sorry.
So when I was going to ask you, how getting back to looking at things, from a security and sort of governance lens, right, or compliance, how important is governance when making the decisions for AI, right? And the reason I ask is fit for purpose, right? So let's say we're using Copilot today because we're an M365 house and all of our stuff is there. So that kind of makes sense for us to be using Copilot. But perhaps there's a use case that some other thing does way better than what is available in Copilot. Do you think it's helpful for organizations to have a governance committee or a tech governance board of some sort to say, bring us those use cases, let's see what the technology looks like and make a decision around where do we go with that, right? Because I feel like, this happens in two ways typically. Either there's no governance whatsoever and everyone just goes out and buys a thing, right? A corporate card and off you go. Or like we said in the beginning with our hands, like turn it off because we don't want it, right? But do you think there's a place in the middle there for governance and these type to help drive these decisions?
Yeah, 100%. Like what you're talking about is quite literally what forms the basis of any good vendor management strategy and vendor management framework. So any technology, whether you're buying a little SaaS tool which costs $5 a month, or whether you're deciding to go and use another tool which could be like an enterprise level implementation, you do need to have some kind of a vendor management lifecycle in place. And one thing which often people in my world get a bad rep for is making these governance processes really verbose. It doesn't need to be verbose. It could be 2 bullet points as long as it clearly articulates what the intent is. So, like to take your example one step further, if I was the IT manager of a company and we had to implement some process like this, we would basically, I would write up a policy which would say everything that we need to purchase or everything that we're looking to purchase needs to have a one-page business case. And you know what? There's so many templates available out there where you've got the one-page business case or the half-page business case. At least articulate why we want this. And let us debate or let us discuss why this would be a good idea for the business. And that could be your policy. Before we buy anything, we'll build a business case, and this is what it needs to be. The second is the governance of where your data is moving. Unfortunately, now the ownership of data is becoming very hazy. We've done really well globally in terms of defining privacy and data regulations and so on and what have you. But one of the biggest bugbears that I have as a consultant working in this space is I often deal, and I'm going to put this as a slight humorous take on this. I often end up dealing with homeless and orphans when it comes to finding data owners and data custodians, because nobody wants to take ownership of that data. Nobody wants to be responsible for that data. And we can get to the point where you're talking about having that middle ground, but it does require a really fundamental step, which is who owns this data, who is responsible for it, who's going to guard it. So that is actually one step in the middle that we need to take. And then from there, we can make that educated decision about, okay, sure, Copilot sucks, for example. If it does, and we want to use, I don't know if we can take brand names on the show, I guess we are. If you're using, for example, Anthropic's Claude, right? Anthropic's Claude is fantastic. Let's say we want to use that. What's the business case? What do we want to put in it? How can you have that discussion if you don't even know what data you have, what systems you have? That is a missing piece. And I don't want to make this sound convoluted, but it's just the fundamentals, right? Do we know all the data that we have? Do we know what obligations come with those data? Where does that data sit? Who's managing the systems where it sits? And who are the people that are interacting with it? Just 5 questions. If we can answer that even on a little table, in a Word table or an Excel table, that's a good starting point. And then we can talk about the governance. And governance, like I said, doesn't need to be verbose. It could be 4 bullet points, 5 bullet points, maybe 2 bullet points.
It's a good point, right? Because the data governance piece, especially, and data ownership, that whole data protection sort of strategy and program doesn't have to be overly complex, and you don't have to go out and buy all of these crazy tools, right? And one of the things when we've previously talked about this on the show is the saying of don't go out and just buy things, right? Because unfortunately, I think a lot of organizations look at data protection and go, that's really difficult. So how about we come back to that next year? And then they do that every year and they never actually get to it. But laying it out the way you've just laid it out, right, is let's answer 5 questions about our data. Let's do that this year. At least that puts us ahead of where we were last year, right? And it helps get us ready for what's to come when we want to start using AI to actually solve business problems, right? I think that's a really important piece of advice.
Such a great way of looking at it, dude. Hey, like just start with 5 questions. If you can answer those 5 questions, you're already ahead.
Yeah.
In a previous life, I used to be a DLP implementation consultant. I can't tell you the amount of projects that got stalled or canceled only because I would always start off by doing a 90-minute workshop with someone saying, hey, I need 90 minutes of your time. I'll bring snacks and food. I need you to tell me this. The conversation would finish in 15 minutes and they would say, yeah, we'll get back to you. We'll get back to you. We'll get back to you. And then they never did. And basically, even the vendors suggested one day the vendor came and elbowed me and said, dude, all you got to do is just switch it on for monitor mode for like 2 weeks and then come back and say, hey, this is what we found. Do you want me to set up policies? I'm like, yeah, but that's not really the right thing, is it? They're like, listen, that's how we do it. And then that was the day I started doing DLP implementations.
But it's a true story, though, because I've been involved in some large sort of data protection programs where the first 3 months was that exactly what you said, right? Which is no snacks. No one gave me snacks, but I did sit on all these phone calls for months where we were kind of trying to get information out of the business, and all we kept getting was, hey, we'll check on that and get back to you next week. And then next week it's the same thing. So distilling it down, I think makes it a lot.
And it's always like I find there's always this like, but what are the best practices around that? But what are the best practices around that?
Are no best practices.
It's like, but for anything, it's always what are the best practices, because they want to start with the best practices. But you say, but it's like, hold on a minute. The best practices for you and the best practices for that guy over there are very, very different, because they're going to apply differently in the organization. We always get these the best practices for what? I mean, some people like their steak medium, some people like it well done. I mean, I mean, is it Gordon Ramsay's best practices? Or like
you wouldn't be allowed in the state of Texas if you liked it well done. I'll tell you that.
You see what I'm saying? Like,
we can't go for dinner, Warren, if you like your steak like that, medium rare.
No, look, I think it depends on where I'm eating the steak.
Fair enough. No. I know where you're going with this. Fair enough. Look, coming back to that best practice, right? So whenever I get asked this question, what's best practice? What are other companies doing in this field? I usually say best practice is taking a baseline and sticking to it. That's best practice. Taking a baseline. Like, what's a baseline? Well, ISO is a baseline. NIST is a baseline. These are baseline standards. They aren't the gold standard. They're the baseline standard. That's what you should be doing as a minimum. But before we, and then I take people through the crawl, walk, run analogy as well. Let's crawl first, which is tell me these 5 things. There are like other things that we do. It's been a bit of an uphill battle for us, but we've kind of been adamant, and now everyone's kind of goes with it. When we take on a new customer, we get them to fill out this, there's no other way to describe it, laborious Excel sheet, which is an intake form. Our job is to now make it simpler, but we will not start any consulting until you fill out that information, because that information are these same questions, the stuff that we're talking about here. Until they can't answer that, we can't help them. And if they don't like it, well, guess what? We don't charge our customers until they fill that out anyways. So we can't help you then. So it's important. Like this is basic stuff. I talk about it with my clients as well. It's the paper napkin test. If you can't tell me your key cybersecurity or information security concerns in 5 bullet points or less, that means you have no clue about what's going on. Is the paper napkin test.
And I think just to wrap things up a little bit, because we're heading towards the top of the hour, I think one of the points we've amplified and the shocking revelation is that AI helps us make bad decisions quicker if we're making bad decisions, and it does not automatically make us adults. So on that bombshell, we'd love to ask you, Saaim, what is it that you want to plug before you leave us?
Look, had a fantastic opportunity to discuss some really interesting topics with you guys. If anyone out there, whether you're a startup, a scale up, wants to get some practical, no BS advice on cybersecurity programs, how to stand them up, how to run them, or if you're just stuck or you've been hit with a client questionnaire that you don't know how to answer, we'd be more than happy to help. And the best way to get in touch with us is just go to our website. It's cybermatters.io. Everything's there. We're one of our core values is radical transparency. So everything we do, how much it costs, how to get in touch, it's all there. So yeah.
Thank you.
I think we might have to, a part 2 episode of talk about the paper napkin test in more detail.
Oh yeah.
I think so.
We could easily spin out another couple of episodes based on what we've spoken about. And the trouble with having a great guest such as yourself is that we always find more to talk about. So we may want to take you up on that for a future episode.
Yeah,
I'm happy to be here. Personally, I have kind of dedicated myself now to kind of spreading the good word, almost like a security evangelist, if you will. People aren't having these conversations, and part of the whole reason for doing podcasts is that something we may have said might spark aha moment in someone. And I think that I've been blessed to be in this industry for a while. It's important to kind of have these conversations and stay away from the marketing jargon.
It's true. So, folks, stay safe. Don't run with scissors. Don't run with ChatGPT before you're ready. And thank you, everyone, for your time.